She whispered I was trouble, but that night, I learned some trouble is worth the risk. I still remember the first time she leaned close enough for her voice to brush against my ear like a secret. It wasn't a scream, not even a warning, it was a whisper, low and deliberate, carrying more weight than any shout could have. "You're trouble," she said, and the way her lips curved when she said it told me she didn't entirely mean it as an insult. My landlady was nothing like the women I knew in my own circle. At 40, she carried herself with a poise that made every room bend a little around her. Her steps were measured, her hair always falling in place as if the world respected her enough not to disturb her. Even when she wore something simple, just a cardigan over a plain blouse, she somehow looked more composed, more graceful than anyone had the right to look in their own living room. That evening, I had left a pair of muddy shoes by the door, and she caught sight of them before I did. She could have scolded me in that sharp, no-nonsense way she sometimes used when the younger tenants tested her patience. Instead, she crossed the space between us quietly, almost conspiratorially. When she leaned in, I noticed the faint trace of jasmine that clung to her hair, the warmth of her presence closing in on me. Her words, soft, teasing, dangerous, seemed to slip beneath my skin. I laughed it off, pretending I didn't feel my chest tighten. But inside, I knew something had shifted. Trouble. The way she said it, I wasn't sure if she was warning me or warning herself. I muttered something clumsy in reply, a half-smile tugging at my lips, but my voice felt caught somewhere between my throat and my chest. For a moment, the air seemed thinner, as if her whisper had stolen the oxygen right out of the hallway. When she pulled back, her eyes lingered on mine just long enough for me to notice the glint of amusement there, or was it something else? Vulnerability, perhaps, buried under layers of control she wasn't ready to let go of. That was the first moment I realized my landlady wasn't simply a figure of authority in this house. She was a woman with edges and softness, teasing lines and hidden shadows. And with that single whisper, she had invited me, without meaning to, into a space I wasn't sure either of us was ready to enter. But I couldn't stop thinking about it. About her. About the weight of a single word that felt less like a warning and more like a door half opened. After that whisper, something shifted between us, though neither of us dared to admit it aloud. She didn't pull away completely, but instead, she began to draw invisible lines, small rules, little reminders, that felt less like house regulations and more like challenges wrapped in politeness. "Don't leave your shoes by the door," she told me one morning, her tone light but her eyes holding mine longer than the words required. "Don't play your music too loud after 9. Another day, don't stay out too late." On the surface, these were simple landlady concerns, the kind anyone might voice. Yet, in the quiet way she said them, there was something more. Almost as if she was daring me to see how close I would come to bending her order. I began to notice her in ways I hadn't before. The sound of her footsteps down the hall had a rhythm to it, like a measured beat against polished wood. When she passed me a piece of mail one afternoon, her fingers brushed mine. It should have meant nothing. Just skin against skin for the briefest second. But it felt like more. It lingered in my chest long after the moment passed, as though the warmth of her hand had imprinted itself into me. Sometimes, when she spoke to me, there was a flicker in her expression, like she was weighing her own restraint against the temptation to let her guard fall. Her scoldings weren't sharp, they were softened by a hint of amusement, as though she enjoyed testing how I'd react. And each time, I couldn't help but push back, not with defiance, but with a smile, a glance that held just a beat longer than necessary. It was during one of these exchanges, standing in the kitchen as she poured herself tea, that I caught her eyes studying me. Not for long, not enough for her to admit it, but long enough for me to feel the unspoken tension threading between us. Her gaze dropped the instant mine rose, but the silence that followed said more than either of us could. These small rules, these quiet tests, became a game neither of us admitted we were playing. She set the boundary, I pretended to obey. And beneath it all, there was a question hanging heavy in the air: was she trying to keep me in my place, or was she hoping I'd step across the line she kept drawing, over and over again? The evening began with silence, the kind that presses in when the power suddenly slips away. One moment the house was alive with the low hum of appliances and the glow of warm lamps, and the next it was swallowed in darkness. Outside, the streetlights had gone out too, leaving only the faint outlines of trees swaying against a muted sky. I heard her voice call softly from the other room. "Power's out again." There was no irritation in her tone, just the weary acceptance of someone who had lived through enough outages to know they always come uninvited. I followed the sound of her footsteps until I found her in the kitchen, striking a match. The brief flare of flame lit her face for an instant, sharp cheekbones, steady eyes, and then the candle caught, filling the room with a soft, golden glow. "Tea?" she asked, as though this was the most natural thing in the world, two people caught in the dark with nothing but time. I nodded, watching her move around the counter, every gesture slowed by the dim light. The scent of jasmine from her earlier perfume mingled with the faint aroma of tea leaves steeping, turning the room into something strangely intimate. We ended up in the living room, a single candle placed between us on the low table. The shadows shifted across her face, softening her features until she seemed younger, freer somehow, as if the darkness had lifted a weight from her shoulders. She leaned back into the couch, her posture more relaxed than I'd ever seen it, and for the first time, she didn't look like my landlady at all, just a woman sitting beside me, sharing the quiet. Conversation came easily, slipping between stories of her travels years ago and small memories from my own restless youth. We laughed at the little things, at how the candle nearly tipped when I gestured too widely, at the absurdity of two people pretending they weren't enjoying the unexpected company. At some point, without realizing it, I had drifted closer. The couch was large, but the distance between us had shrunk to just inches. Her knee brushed against mine when she shifted, a fleeting contact that sent a pulse of awareness through me. She didn't move away. The candle flickered, casting shadows that made it hard to tell where the room ended and she began. And in that fragile moment, with the world outside stilled by the outage, it felt like the house itself was holding its breath, waiting to see what would happen next. The power was still out, the candle burning low, when the laughter between us began to soften into something quieter. For a while, neither of us spoke. The silence wasn't uncomfortable, it was heavy in another way, filled with the weight of things unsaid. I watched her trace the rim of her teacup with a fingertip, her eyes lowered, as though she were fighting a thought she wasn't sure she wanted to share. Then, without looking at me, she said it. "I've been alone for a long time." The words weren't dramatic, but the way she spoke them, steady, almost casual, made my chest tighten. She sipped her tea, but her hand trembled just enough that I noticed. She tried to cover it with a small smile. "It's not as tragic as it sounds. Life just moves differently after a while. People leave, routines settle, and before you know it, silence becomes the loudest thing in your house." I wanted to say something to break that quiet ache in her voice, but all I managed was honesty. "I notice things," I admitted, my voice lower than I intended. She looked up at me then, her brows slightly arched. I swallowed. "The way you bite your lip when you're nervous. The way you pause at the door before locking it, like you're waiting for something, or someone, to walk through. Even the way you scold me, it never feels like you really want me to stop. It feels like you're noticing me too." Her eyes widened slightly, then softened, and for a moment I thought I had gone too far. But she didn't shut me down. She didn't laugh it off. Instead, she let the silence stretch, her gaze locked with mine, as though weighing the truth in my words. Her lips parted as if to speak, then closed again. I could see the conflict flickering behind her expression, the practiced restraint of someone who had learned to live behind rules, battling against the very human desire to be seen. The candle crackled faintly. Outside, the wind brushed against the windows, filling the space with the hush of the world moving on without us. Finally, she whispered, barely audible, "You noticed too much." But her voice wasn't sharp. It was tender, trembling, almost relieved. And in that moment, I knew that beneath the walls she had built, there was someone aching to be understood. Someone who had just, perhaps unwillingly, let me see her. The storm outside had passed, but the air inside still carried the fragile stillness of our confessions. I found myself lingering in the living room longer than I should, reluctant to let the night end. She busied herself tidying the cups, though there was no real need, just the nervous rhythm of someone who needed her hands to keep busy. When she returned, I stood, meaning to thank her for the tea and retreat before I crossed some line. But as I reached for my jacket, she stopped me with a small, almost involuntary gesture. Her hand rose, hesitated midair, then moved toward me. "There's something on your shoulder," she murmured. Her tone was casual, but her voice carried a faint tremor. She brushed at the fabric with her fingertips, slowly, carefully, though there was nothing there to remove. The touch was fleeting, but it lit something inside me. My body stilled, every sense narrowing to that single point of contact. I could feel the warmth of her skin even through the cloth, the way her fingers lingered an instant too long before slipping away. When she realized, she pulled her hand back quickly, almost guiltily, and looked anywhere but at me. I should have stepped back, should have eased the tension with a laugh, but instead I stayed still, caught in the moment. Her eyes flicked up at last, meeting mine. And in that brief collision of gazes, everything we hadn't said seemed to flood the air. I wanted to take her hand, to hold it before she could retreat fully, but hesitation anchored me. I was young, untested in moments like this. She, on the other hand, had built her life around control. It was that balance, her caution and my longing, that kept us frozen, both aware of the fragile thread binding us. "You should get some rest," she said finally, her voice softer now, almost an apology. But her eyes betrayed her words. They lingered on me, full of something warmer, something she was fighting to suppress. I nodded, though my throat was dry. As I slipped my arms into my jacket, I could still feel her touch ghosting across my shoulder, more vivid than any real mark. That night, as I lay awake in my room, I realized it wasn't her words or her scolding that haunted me. It was that near touch, innocent on the surface, but heavy with everything she hadn't allowed herself to give. I was halfway to the door, jacket in hand, when the weight of the night pressed down on me. I knew I should leave, it was late, and the boundaries between us had already blurred far more than either of us had planned. Yet something in her silence made me linger, as if she, too, was reluctant to let the moment end. She walked with me to the hallway, her steps quiet, unhurried. The candle's glow followed us, shadows slipping along the walls. I reached for the doorknob, meaning to turn it quickly, but before I could, I felt her presence behind me, close enough that the warmth of her body brushed the back of my arm. "You really are trouble," she whispered. The words were the same as before, but this time her voice carried a different weight. It wasn't playful anymore, it was layered with something deeper, hesitation, desire, warning. The breath of her whisper grazed the side of my neck, and I shivered before I could stop myself. I turned slightly, just enough to see her face in the dim light. Her eyes locked onto mine, steady yet conflicted, as though daring me to step further and fearing I actually would. My chest tightened with the urge to close the space between us, to let action speak where words failed. But instead, I answered with the only thing my restless heart could form. A half smile, my voice low and unsteady. "Then punish me tonight." The words slipped out before I could second-guess them, hanging in the air between us like a challenge I wasn't sure I had the right to make. Her breath caught, a barely audible sound, but enough to tell me she'd heard the truth in my tone. For a moment, she didn't move. The world outside seemed to vanish, leaving only the steady rhythm of her breathing, the thrum of my pulse in my ears. Her hand rose as if to touch me, then hesitated. She held it there, suspended in the air, fingers trembling slightly. I could see the battle playing out in her eyes, the practiced discipline of a woman who'd spent years guarding her heart against temptation, clashing with the raw human pull that now drew her closer. The silence stretched until it felt unbearable. I waited, hardly breathing, as the line between us grew thinner, fragile, and impossibly charged. When she finally lowered her hand without touching me, she smiled. It was soft, almost wistful, but her eyes told me the truth. The distance she kept was not rejection, only restraint. Her smile lingered, soft and knowing, even as her hand fell back to her side. For a heartbeat, I thought that was the end, that she would retreat into her walls, and I would slip out into the night with only the ghost of her whisper to keep me awake. But then, almost hesitantly, she reached for me again. This time, her hand didn't stop midway. Her palm came to rest against my cheek, warm and steady. The gesture was so simple, so human, that it nearly undid me. Her thumb brushed lightly across my skin, and the tenderness of it carried more weight than any confession could have. "You don't know what you're asking for," she murmured. Her tone was gentle, not scolding, as if she were trying to protect me as much as herself. But the faint tremor in her voice betrayed her. I didn't answer right away. Words felt too clumsy for what pressed between us. Instead, I leaned ever so slightly into her touch, letting her feel the honesty in my silence. For a moment, we just stood there, two people from different chapters of life, bound together by a closeness neither had expected nor planned. When she finally stepped forward, closing the last of the distance, it wasn't with fire or recklessness. It was with the quiet surrender of someone too tired to pretend anymore. She let her forehead rest against my chest, her body leaning into mine with a weight that spoke of trust. Instinctively, my arms rose around her, not to claim, but to hold, to steady her, to say without words that she wasn't as alone as she feared. Her cheek pressed against me, and I could feel the faint rhythm of her heartbeat, uneven at first, then slowly matching the steadiness of my own. I lowered my chin slightly, catching the faint scent of jasmine in her hair. Outside, rain had begun to fall, a soft, rhythmic tapping against the windows, cocooning us in a world that belonged only to us. Neither of us spoke. There was no need. The unspoken admission hung in the air, that we had crossed into something deeper than tenant and landlady, deeper than rules or whispers. It wasn't punishment she had given me, nor was it trouble I had caused her. It was something simpler, more profound, permission. Permission to be seen. Permission to be close. Permission to matter. And in that quiet embrace, I realized we didn't need to define what came next. For now, it was enough. Enough to know that in her arms, the silence no longer felt empty. It felt like home.